Hi, welcome to week 6 in the Nonfiction workshop writing course. I hope you're enjoying it so far. We're going to spend a little more time on our scene assignment again, and we're going to take a look this week at a very powerful example of a scene usage, I should say, in a piece of literature written by Talese. The article in question is called The Soft Psyche of Josh Logan. Josh Logan was a very famous producer and director in the theater in the United States in the 50s and 60s and 70s. He did South Pacific and some other very important musicals. And this particular piece combines a profile and narrative storytelling. And you're going to see all of those techniques coming to life in it. Uses reporting laced with actual dialogue based on observing rehearsals and reporting on them as actual moment-to-moment scenes rather than using summaries of what happened. So, who is Talese? Well, he's still around, thank heavens. Talese was a newspaper writer who worked for the New York Times in the 60s, 56 to 1965, and he wrote a book about the New York Times. But ever since, he's been making a living writing books and writing freelance articles, so he's been all over the place in terms of being published. If you want to go back into Google and learn more about him, you can Google an article he wrote called Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. And it's a wonderful article using these techniques of observation and the literary devices that we've been talking about. Just to summarize things so far now, we made a list of some of the key techniques of nonfiction writing. I gave them to you early in the course, and I gave them to you again in the reading for this week. And I want to sort of run through them so that you can have a vocabulary about what's going on in these nonfiction stories. When you're looking at other people's work, you can see what they're doing, and you also might do your own work and take a look at it and see how many of these things you're doing. These are just little windows into the kind of techniques a person can use. Here's some of the emphasis. So one of the things you're going to see a lot of is attention to detail. Sensory perception. By that I mean it's the obvious ones of sight and sound, but also olfactory. You know, there are some times where a smell can tell you very much about a story. So be aware about those things and don't be afraid to put them in your story. If you're at a paper mill somewhere and the air is pungent, be sure to put that in your story. Look for the telling details. We've talked about that a lot. Telling details are something that help us remember a character or a place, something about it that's unique. I mean, Paris wouldn't be Paris without the Eiffel Tower, for example. If you're writing about Donald Trump, you're going to notice the fact that he's wearing dark suits and he wears a very long necktie. Quite often it's either red or blue. This would be a telling detail about Donald Trump. It tells us that he's a meticulous dresser, and he also wants to put his best foot forward all the time when he's being photographed. Clinical detail is something else that you might have come across. It's rather rare, probably, but the idea being here again, telling us specific things about something that happened that we won't forget. In writing about the assassination of President Kennedy, for example, quite a few of the articles mentioned what happened when he went into surgery and how harsh his wounds were and how shocking they probably were. And that helps us understand what Jacqueline Kennedy went through from reading this material. It also communicates to us the weight of this event. Another aspect of writing for nonfiction is the organization of a story. Of course, this is true in all writing, but it's just as important there. The idea there is to make sure that you have logical theme lines. You make assertions, you use digressions to back them up, or you give us facts, evidence that backs them up. It's a beautiful day today, that's an assertion. The temperature is 83 degrees, the sky is clear, and the winds are almost calm. Those are facts that back up the assertions. So looking for logical statements and done in a way that the reader can follow easily. Chronologies, something you don't think about, but of course most stories have chronologies. The reference being to things happened, 8 a.m. something happens, 9 a.m. something happens, 10 a.m. something happens. Things happen sequentially over time. So that's why chronologies become important. The narratives themselves, and that's all the materials that are being tied together. These scenes, this dialogue, the characters, the description of the characters. This is what makes up a narrative. Quotes. Quotes are really important. By taking the words from someone and putting them on the page, the person tends to become alive on the page. We start to see who they are. We do this from the kind of language they use, from the values, judgments they make in determining what they're going to say and how they say it, and also maybe the colloquialisms. If they're from the South, they may have some interesting things to say. If they're from Europe or from England, they may say things in a different way than we do. The quotes help us evaluate people. They tell us how they speak, and then they tell us what they want to say. And what they want to say may be very important to understanding who they are. Conversations. In the scene exercise, you should be looking for a conversation. Here we're going to see two different personalities interacting with language. And again, by capturing that language, you can tell who the people are and what they're trying to communicate to us. A telling quote. So a telling quote is a kind of a quote that really defines someone or a situation. If you recall when President Trump referred to the disturbance in Charlottesville, where there was a big demonstration against the idea of tearing down Civil War statues. It turned into something else, though, and it became racial and became xenophobic, and the Nazi people got involved, and so we saw a demonstration that was very harsh. But when President Trump talked about it, he said there were, at one point he referred to the fact that there were fine people, and then he added, on both sides. And this sort of labeled him for who he is. If he would think that the people who wore Nazi swastikas on their shirts and were chanting anti-Jewish slogans were fine people, we would kind of wonder what kind of a person Mr. Trump is. And this is a telling quote, something where a person sort of labels themselves with the words they use. Authentic language is also important. Usually we're talking about foul language. If you're writing a story about combat soldiers in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in Vietnam, they speak in very strong language sometimes. So it might make sense for you to use their language in a story, if that's who they are, and that will tell you something about them. So authentic language can be important. Another part of the storytelling is the point of view of the writer. Where are you coming from? One of the things we're going to do in the next exercise is write from your experience. So you get a chance to say something that happened to you and then how it affected you. And that's called immersion or experiential first-person perspective. The views of the writer and subject who see what happens and are affected by it are communicated in the story. The omniscient observer, that's something we know from literature. It's this third person that's not around, not identified in the story, but seems to know what's happening. And that's a way of telling stories. So stream of consciousness is sort of a quick expression on the page of the kind of thoughts that are going through a person's mind. You turn around and there's a grizzly bear. What's going through your mind? Or you are driving 60 miles an hour and a deer runs in front of you. What comes to your mind? And if you can express that through a stream of consciousness, we can again appreciate what the character is going through. Narcissistic subjective journalism is something we haven't looked at here in this course either. Hunter Thompson, a writer for Rolling Stone, uses this a lot. So Hunter Thompson writes in this very hyperbolic style to create an effect. We didn't look at this in this course, but it's an interesting part of the history of this literary journalism and the nonfiction writing that we've been talking about. Another place we go for information sometimes, and we use it in our writing, is eyewitness reports. It's people who see something happen, and it's the only way we can find out exactly what occurred, given the time and the opportunity. For example, in the shooting in El Paso, people in the Walmart who observed what happened there are interviewed about exactly what they saw, and they convey their impressions of it, and it's a way of telling a story. So an eyewitness account is another method. Some of the literary concepts and devices that also are used a lot in nonfiction writing include the active voice. Do not write in passive. The active voice is much more powerful. Just use active verbs to carry your story instead of using a lot of passive writing. Anecdotes are another good method. Anecdotes are tiny little stories about something that happened, whereas, for example, the gay Talese piece is an expanded story about Josh Logan and what was happening to him when he was launching this new play. An anecdote might be something that happened in just an incident, and it could be told in 20 or 30 words or 40 words, but still have the aspects of a scene and characters in it, but would just be very brief. Clutter words, well, I guess we know what those are by now. We've been reading our friend William Zinsser, and his concept essentially is do not use words that you do not have to use to tell your story. He's especially concerned about the overuse of too many adjectives and too many adverbs. It was a very, very beautiful day. It was a beautiful day. He was really dead. He was dead. You know, eliminate those extra words that you don't need and keep your story concise. Conciseness itself, of course, is a virtue, because whatever you write has to go in a space if it's going to be printed, and it's a trade-off always. If you're limited to 500 words, 1,000 words, whatever the limit, if you don't write concisely, you can only write about fewer things then. So it's economic to write concisely and get to the point of what you're trying to say. Digressions. A narrative line is the story is being told, this happens, this happens, this happens. A digression is a breakaway from that line, where you tell about something that happened in the past or something that gives perspective to what's going on in your story. But it takes away from the driving narrative of your story. Nothing wrong with a digression, it can be very effective, but watch out for too many of them. Another key technique for any kind of writing is exposition. Exposition essentially is a summary of events. It's telling what happened, but in a summary manner. It would be like saying Lewis and Clark bought some canoes in St. Louis, got on the Missouri River, headed west, and after about half a year got there and set up camp in Astoria, Oregon. Well, that's what they did, in fact, but that would be exposition, summing it up, rather than telling us exactly step by step how they did it, giving us a real narrative story about day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, and the events that unfolded. So exposition is a condensation. Another interesting literary device is a journal. This is used a lot by people writing in newspapers. When the story isn't as important perhaps as what is seen. In a sense, it's what Jonathan Rabin did in his story about Ketchikan. He gave us some details about what it was like to be there, what he saw, what people were saying. There wasn't a storyline that was clear perhaps, except for the fact that he was walking through the city. But there were enough interesting details to write something compelling and interesting. Metaphors, well, of course, metaphors are a classic literary technique. Language used symbolically rather than literally. Again, we had a great example of that from Charles Dickens when he was writing about the incident in Rome where everybody was waiting for the execution to take place. and at one point he described a parliament of dogs. Well, of course he didn't mean the dogs had formed a parliament, but the idea was that there was a cacophony of barking and people running around, and the image he came up with was with parliament. So he used that as a metaphor. Another interesting device is the so-called offstage voice. This is something that Tom Wolfe has done quite a bit of. And literally it's just like what it sounds like. If you're watching a play and if somebody yelled in from the outside, and then look what happened, or something like that. It's a voice that sort of interrupts the story, and we know it's coming from the writer, but it isn't integrated into the story very well. And it's done to demonstrate interest or surprise or something like that. Satires, I think you probably know what those are. Events and anecdotes reported in an ironic tone, tongue-in-cheek. So we make fun of something. A person who was very good at that, of course, was Mark Twain, who would take a real situation and then depict it in very funny terms, tell what was odd about it or what was bizarre about it or what was ironic about it. Similes, of course, similes are just a certain kind of metaphor. One where we use the word like. The phrase that comes to mind is, they moved like ghosts. Well, of course, they weren't ghosts, but the idea is that they were stealthy and moving perhaps in the darkness, and so something was happening, and it reminded the writer of ghosts. And finally, of course, a big aspect of writing is variety. You want to be sure not to fall into a sort of a monotone of expression, writing compound sentences over and over and over again. Think about varying the length of your sentences for effect. Again, think of the way conversation works. One of my techniques is to read my material out loud and see how it sounds and see if it makes sense. That's another good place, of course, for picking up clutter words, words you don't need. But variety is important in your presentation as well, so it's something to look for. It might be fun to go through the story by Talese and sort of identify what you see in that story compared to this list. Or take your last piece and see what you did and how you use these techniques. So we're just trying to give you a language so that you can talk about what's going on in these stories. You can explain it to somebody else, and you can see where something works and it doesn't work, maybe because of some of these reasons. So this is a new vocabulary for you in terms of this nonfiction writing and narrative nonfiction.